Should you be shooting in RAW? What's the difference between RAW and JPEG? Will RAW actually make your pictures look better? Let's talk photography. One of the most common questions DSLR users have is, should I be shooting in RAW mode or JPEG mode? Unfortunately, there is no real easy answer. However, if you understand what's going on in your camera when it records in either mode, you can determine which one is the best for you. Now, the beginning of the process is the same either way, whether you're shooting RAW or JPEG. The light will come in through the lens, the shutter will open, and the light will hit the sensor. That's the same in either mode. Now, I'm going to use this whiteboard as an example sensor, and typically a sensor has millions or tens of millions of pixels on it. This is a simplified example. Each of these would be a different pixel on the sensor that would sense light. You can see in this example, this is a very dark corner of the picture, 100 being 100% dark or black, and 97 being 97% black or a dark gray. So when the light hits each and every pixel, that pixel will record how much light it detected. Now here's where the process changes depending on if you're shooting RAW or JPEG. If you're shooting RAW, the camera just saves the pure data straight from the sensor from each pixel depending on how much light it detected. It'll also save some other things like white balance and metadata for your camera and your lens, but in general it's just the raw data from that sensor. A JPEG, on the other hand, goes through many different processes before it's actually saved as a photo file. It can go through different filters to make it sharper, to make the color stand out, to change the contrast, and this all depends on your camera, whatever process it uses to enhance that photo. On top of that, JPEG is a compressed file format. The goal of a JPEG is to get the file size to be smaller so that it's easier to transmit over the internet and it doesn't take up as much space on hard drives or memory cards. So inherently, by converting a photo to JPEG, you're going to lose a lot of data and information. Exactly how a JPEG compresses the file is pretty complex. It uses a lot of math, but I'll give you a quick rundown. If we go back to this example where there's this dark gray stripe here, the JPEG algorithm might look at this area and say, yeah, that's close enough to black, and just make this whole area black. That way you can just write, yep, this whole area is black, and it saves some file space by doing this. In general, this loss of data isn't a big deal because, like I said, the human eye can't see most of the differences that it's taking away. However, it becomes relevant when you start editing these photos in a program like Lightroom. If you're shooting in RAW, you still have all the original sensor data that Lightroom can use to enhance your photo in many different ways. If you're shooting in JPEG, you no longer have that data and you don't have as much freedom when you're editing your photos. Here in Lightroom, I'll show you how this affects your photos in the real world. Here I've taken a picture of a windmill in a cornfield. This is the original RAW file. All I did was export the RAW file and re-import it as a JPEG. And you can see I'm going back and forth, and there's really no difference in between them. So like I said, if you're not planning on doing any editing, then JPEG is your best bet because the file size will be smaller and it may even look a little bit better out of the camera. But where you really start to see a difference is when you either bring down the highlights or you raise the shadows. The RAW still has all the pure data from the sensor, where the JPEG took a lot of that data out. So I'm just going to come over here and bring down the highlights and the whites all the way. I'm going to bring the shadows and the contrast all the way up. I'm going to do this on both photos. And then I'm going to zoom in. Now with the RAW file, you can still see around the sun, it has a good fade from the sun into the sky. However, on the JPEG, you can actually see a pretty harsh distinction here and a lot of blocking where the JPEG took away data during its compression. If your question is, should I be shooting in RAW or JPEG, then it really comes down to whether or not you're going to be editing your photos. If you're looking for a smaller file size and decent image quality right out of the camera, then JPEG is your best bet. However, if you're going to be using a program like Lightroom to edit your photos afterwards, then you're going to get the best information and versatility out of your photos using RAW. There's one other thing I want to mention about RAW that I don't hear very many people talking about, and that's the noise you see in the image on the computer screen. When you open a RAW file on a computer, it's going to look pretty noisy or grainy, and that's because each pixel is a different color straight from that sensor, so it's not going to look as smooth. A JPEG out of the camera, on the other hand, it's going to look pretty smooth, but that's because of that compression process. Now, when I first started shooting RAW, this was kind of a turnoff to me because I thought the image quality was lower, but in reality, you can either fix that in Lightroom, or once you actually output your file as a JPEG, it will go through the same conversion process and smoothen itself out. If you're interested in learning how to edit your pictures to make them sharp without getting too much noise, then click the link below. I go through an entire Lightroom workflow process and teach you how to do that. Now, there are three more minor things I want to mention about RAW. The first is when you take a picture in RAW, the white balance is actually a value that's saved alongside the picture. So it's not actually affecting the sensor and the image at all. That way you can use that white balance value in Lightroom and adjust the white balance of your picture. This has a much more accurate and drastic effect than if you were to adjust white balance using a JPEG. Second, when you're editing a RAW file, it's what's called a non-destructive edit. It means you're never actually affecting the original RAW data. Anything you're editing is just affecting the JPEG or TIFF that you're going to output. So if you want to keep your original file, it's much easier to do with RAW. With a JPEG, any edit you make and save over that JPEG is permanent. You can't get the original JPEG back unless you made a backup. The third thing is a RAW can be used as an original proof. Obviously you can go from RAW to JPEG, but you cannot go from JPEG to RAW. So if you ever need proof that that file is your own, as long as you have that RAW file, you can prove that it's your photo. Today we learned the differences between RAW and JPEG. Thanks for watching. My name's Corey. See you next time on Let's Talk Photography.